My name is Christopher Hurt. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the the Division of Infectious Diseases at UNC. I came here in 2006 after going to college and medical school at University of Florida. So any Gators out there? Like 3 of them, great. And then I went to Brown University for internal medicine, and then I came to UNC for my fellowship in infectious diseases, and I stayed around as faculty. So I'm very happy that this is that you all are here, and this is as well attended as it is. Topic today is sex, drugs, and HIV. So everybody's favorites, right? The outline of what we're going to talk about, a little bit about the goals and kind of my purpose in talking to you all. An overview about the place that drugs have had throughout the epidemic, since the very start, really. An overview of what's going on in this country and globally in terms of HIV and drug use. I know you've had some of this already, but we won't go into too much detail. And then details about the drugs themselves. What are they? Why are they addictive in the first place? How do you do them? And why do we care in terms of HIV and HIV prevention? And then some recent developments that have happened over the past several years that are of note with drugs in this country. All right. So has anybody ever seen this before? Couple, right? So I have a copy that's actually hanging in my office down at the medical campus. This was painted by Keith Haring. Keith Haring was an artist in the 80s who started off doing street art, graffiti, and became very, very famous. And he painted this in 1989. That was a year before he died of AIDS. And I think that this still has resonance for, at least to me, and I hope to you all as well. I'd like to think that at least this is at least part of why you all are here, is that unless we learn about these things, this is just going to continue. That the only hope that we have of really stopping the epidemic is to learn as much as you can about the ways that you get HIV, the different factors that are involved. And when things that are kind of hot button issues like drug use, it's important to be as informed as possible for yourselves so that you can make an educated decision about whether or not using is right for you, and if you decide to use, how to do it safely so that you're not hurting yourself and you're not hurting others. The overall purpose of this talk is therefore to kind of provoke you all a little bit into challenging the ways that you think about drug use and the kinds of people that use drugs. And to, again, give you a little bit more information about the drugs themselves and the place that they have in terms of causing HIV risk or mediating HIV risk. All right, very teeny one slide on virology, because I know other people have talked much more than I will have time to do. HIV is 2 retroviruses, so there's HIV-1 and HIV-2. HIV-1 is the one that's causing the global epidemic. HIV-2 is geographically restricted to Western Africa. The first case was confirmed from 1959. So this is, although we kind of date the epidemic as starting when the CDC published the first reports of pneumocystis pneumonia in 1981, this was actually brewing for a lot longer than that. So this patient was somebody who died in the Congo and had tissue preserved, and that tissue was later tested and found to be HIV positive. Of course, the first 5 cases were 30 years ago last year, so June of 1981. It was men who have sex with men that had pneumocystis pneumonia, PCP, in Los Angeles. And then it wasn't for another 3 years before the relationship between the AIDS virus, between HIV, what was then called HTLV-3, and the disease state were confirmed through testing. So that's just a little bit of background. The beginning of the epidemic itself is it's an interesting history, and I think it's important because drugs have played a very central role from the very beginning of the epidemiologic search for what was going on with HIV. In the the 70s, there was a lot of partying that went on. And when the first people started getting sick with HIV, CDC and other groups said, well, maybe it's just that they partied too hard. Maybe their immune systems are just wearing out because they did so many drugs and had so many STDs or whatever it was from the 70s. And one of the things that was implicated relatively early were poppers. So poppers are an inhalant that's used. It's a smooth muscle relaxant. So it makes it easier if you're the bottom or the receptive partner for anal sex. It makes it easier for you to have sex. And they were very widely used in the gay community and very heavily used in the 70s by both straight people and gay people. And so they thought initially, well, maybe it's a contaminant in poppers. And so they looked and they couldn't find anything that was conclusive. And then additional cases started sprouting up. So they recognized that there were cases that were happening in babies where mothers had been infected, and there were cases in injection drug users. And that combination of the different populations that were being impacted and the role that injection drug users had very early on was very important for the epidemiologic analyses and the investigations that led to the identification of HIV as the cause of this new condition. The similarities were very close to hepatitis B. So hepatitis B is a bloodborne virus, so transmission is very similar to HIV, so blood and body fluids. Very infectious, and it was very common up until really the 1980s when the vaccine really became widespread in use. That vaccine was developed with the assistance of gay men because the prevalence of hepatitis B among gay men at the end of the 1970s was so high that they were integral into developing the vaccine program that was later implemented nationwide. So the CDC and other groups said, well, you know, this is behaving like hepatitis B. We're seeing these cases in specific groups. Maybe this is bloodborne. And that's where things very quickly, even before there was confirmation that the virus was the virus, there were ads like this saying that you can't get AIDS from shaking hands or from toilet seats or from doorknobs, which was really critical because I think it's very difficult for you guys to imagine what this was like at the time, with maybe the exception of pandemic flu when in 2009, when there was that kind of panic about there's something new that's hitting us and we don't exactly know what it is, and people could get really sick. But this was very widespread, and nobody really knew enough to know how to protect themselves or what to do. So this led, the whole HIV epidemiology world was now centered on sex and drugs, and specifically anal sex, which is the highest transmission risk comes from anal intercourse, unprotected anal intercourse. These are taboo subjects in the United States. We don't talk about this. We're still a very puritanical society, as advanced and modern as we think we are. Sex still, elicits kind of twitters in the audience, and people don't want to think about it or talk about it publicly. But that is exactly what needed to happen at that point in time. But it didn't. I'm sure that you've seen this map from other people. This is the most recent update from the UN. And what I wanted to point out is three things. So Canada, America's hat, Great Britain, and Australia, okay? So notice that the color of those is less intense than the United States, okay? Meaning that the prevalence in those countries is less than it is in the United States. There's a reason for that. This is not just a magic occurrence. There's very much a reason for that. And there's also a reason why Russia is as intense as it is. That's injection drug use in Russia, which we'll get to in a bit. But this lower prevalence in these three countries was very, very definitely related to the governmental response at the early part of the epidemic. So how many of you are Reagan babies? How many were born in the first term, 1980 to 84? Okay, second term, 84 to 88? Okay, and after 88? Wow, okay. I'm a Carter baby, so So Reagan's first term started in 1980. And when Reagan came to power, that government was extremely conservative. And it came to power on a basis of family values and politicizing family values and morality. And it was very popular, it resonated, and it worked, and he got elected. At the same time, in Britain, Margaret Thatcher's government was elected around the same time, also a conservative government, with very much the same general kinds of principles, but the British have never been as morality-driven in politics as the US. So that difference in prevalence between the US and the former Commonwealth countries of Britain is very definitely related to what Margaret Thatcher did in response to data that was coming out of her health ministers at the time in the early part of the epidemic. And in Britain, overwhelmingly, it was among injection drug users. So that was the group that was being impacted the most. And in a span of a year and a half in the mid-'80s, in Edinburgh, Scotland, the prevalence of HIV in injection drug using communities went from 0 to 56% in a year and a half. That's an explosion. And so what the Thatcher government did was very practical. And what they said was, if we spend a little now, we may save a lot later. And they also had the National Health Service that had been instituted after World War II. So this was an infrastructure that was already in place throughout the UK that they utilized, in addition to other things. And what they put into place was needle exchange. Needle exchange is not a terribly radical idea, although I think we think of it maybe that way in the United States. The idea is if you've got a rig and you've used it, then get a new one. Don't share it. If you don't have the means to get a new syringe every time that you want to shoot, then you have a problem. Then you either got to reuse the same ones that you got and sterilize them somehow, or you get a fresh needle, a clean needle. And what Britain did was they put through pharmacies and through offices of the National Health Service, they had these stickers on the windows that said that this was a pharmacy that would allow you to bring in your used needles and exchange them for fresh ones. It was a cheap solution, and it worked. The kits came with a syringe, some saline, an alcohol swab so you don't inject whatever's living on your skin into your vein, and a couple of gauze pads. That's it. In Australia, they did much the same thing, but they also had in public areas, they had these boxes where you could drop your needles that you've already used, and that they would later come and pick them up. So it's a secure way of dropping off your used needles. This is not a crazy idea, but it very much worked. And so that implementation of needle exchange, by the year 2005, there were 27 million clean needles that were distributed in Britain in that year. But by that year, they had successfully dropped the proportion of new cases that were attributable to injection drug use to only 6%. In the US, in that same year, it was 20%. That's a lot. And a lot of that effort is attributable to the implementation of needle exchange in Britain. Canada started funding needle exchange in 1989 on a nationwide basis. So federal money in Canada can be used to pay for needle exchange programs. But in 2003 in Vancouver in British Columbia, they did something even more radical, which was to set up a clinic. And you know you're big when you make it in the New York Times. So it only took 8 years for it to make it into the New York Times. But they set up this clinic that was called Insight. And what Insight does is it provides a clean, safe space where users can bring in whatever it is that they want to shoot. They bring it in, they get a kit that has all sterile materials. It has gauze, alcohol pads, tourniquet. It has a little packet of citric acid, which makes heroin dissolve easier, and a little bullet of saline. And they can shoot up in a monitored environment. There's crash carts there if they overdose. And right next door to the bays where the users can shoot are resources for STD testing, HIV testing, hepatitis testing, linkage to treatment programs, so methadone clinics and that sort of thing. And this was a very radical thing for Canada. And recently, last year, the Canadian Supreme Court heard arguments about whether or not this should be allowed to continue, and it was allowed to continue. This is only in Vancouver, but Vancouver had a very, very large intravenous drug use epidemic that was blooming in the late 90s and early 2000s. So this was a direct response to that idea. This is just a takeout from that article. So we're situated in the worst block of an area once home to the fastest growing AIDS epidemic in North America is one reason why they're succeeding in lowering new AIDS infection rates, while other cities are getting worse. Offering clean needles and aggressively testing and treating those who may be infected with HIV, they're offering proof that the idea that was once controversial actually works, that if you treat people, while it may be expensive, that you protect not just the people that are using, but you protect everybody else as well. There's a public health benefit from treating individuals. So does this even work? So these things have been implemented, and anecdotally circumstantial evidence says that they probably work. WHO in 2004 issued a report saying, yeah, this actually does work. And the bulleted items in the report are these, which is that there was compelling evidence that if you increased availability and utilization of sterile injecting, that it reduces HIV infection among injection drug users. It's not rocket science. There's no convincing evidence of major unintended negative consequences. The idea being that if you make needles more available, people are going to use more, that people are going to start using because they can get a free needle. That needle syringe programs are cost effective, that they have additional benefits apart from reducing HIV infection, and that specifically that legislation banning injection paraphernalia was a barrier to control of HIV, and it turns out other bloodborne infectious diseases. So this is not, this is the WHO. They're not a particularly, they don't have the resources to kind of go out on a limb. They're an international public health agency. That's what they're there for. So this, I think, had a little bit of oomph, and this, I think, clearly would have supported the idea of what was going on in Vancouver. All of this points to the idea of harm reduction. So harm reduction is the idea that even though somebody is going to do something that you don't agree with, that you don't make them stop. You can certainly counsel them and encourage them to stop, but your job as a public health person or an agency of the public health is to help protect those individuals, enable them to do whatever it is that they want to do with their lives, enable them to do it safely, and to protect others. And that's harm reduction in a nutshell. It's meeting people where they are rather than imposing your will or your legislating your morality on them. And harm reduction is a real thing. It's all over the world. And it turns out the United States is the only country in the world that currently, unfortunately, has a ban on federal funding going to needle exchange. The only country. So if it works, and we have all these different public health agencies and all these different groups saying that this works, and there's evidence to support this, scientific evidence that this works, why isn't this more widespread? I don't think it's an overstatement to say that this man is the reason. So who knows who this is? Anybody know who this is? I hear lots of sisses. That's probably Jesse. So Jesse Helms was a senator from the great state of North Carolina who, through his legislative career, was a extraordinarily conservative person and was very, very potent in his ability to stop legislation from happening. Throughout his early part of his career, he was very controversial. In the 80s, he was sort of instrumental in the conservative movement that wound up electing President Reagan. And that administration felt an allegiance of sorts to working with Senator Helms and other groups within the Congress that were extremely conservative. So Jesse was able to block legislation that was putting forth money to NIH, to other agencies that were trying to support people doing research and prevention, not only for injection drug users, but for gay and bisexual people as well. And he was, very, vocal about what he thought was going on. He wants to reduce the amount of federal money spent on AIDS sufferers because he says they're deliberate, disgusting, revolting conduct that's responsible for their disease. It's blaming the victim. We've got to have some common sense, Mr. Helms maintained in an interview, about a disease transmitted by people deliberately engaging in unnatural acts. So, he had his heart on his sleeve. That was in 1995. Jesse had a change of heart, however, and the miracle was Bono. So Jesse Helms met Bono, and Bono was able to convince Senator Helms to reverse his opinion about funding AIDS prevention work. This was a kind of momentous thing. This happened around 2001. And they got along famously. They apparently really liked each other, which is a little bizarre to me. That's a lot bizarre to me. So he reversed his opposition to help on AIDS, but there was a catch. So he changed his mind, but it was only about what was going on overseas. So Bono came to him and said, there are women and children dying in Africa through no fault of their own. And Senator Helms said, well, we got to do something about that. But he said, this was in 2002, that the homosexual lifestyle was the cause of the spread of AIDS in the United States. Period. It was the gays. And that spending on AIDS research took necessary money away from more worthy areas of study like heart problems and other medical defects of humanity. That's a great turn of phrase. But it's crazy, in my opinion. He's dead now, and a lot has changed. This is the kind of thing that Jesse Helms was opposed to. This was not putting up billboards explaining to people how to have gay sex or explaining to people how to shoot up. It was providing resources like this about how to put on a condom. Or if you're going to clean, if you have needles but you don't have access to needle exchange, because the federal government banned it, that you can sterilize your rib so that if you do need to share it for whatever reason, that you minimize the risk of transmission to other people. On the bottom is Bleach Man. So Bleach Man was a cartoon series that was put out by public health groups that was intended to show people who were injecting drugs how to clean their needles safely using bleach. This is not crazy stuff. This is, but this was actively put down on the floor of Congress, on the floor of the Senate. And it's kind of, it's very unsatisfying and unpleasant kind of story in our country. That's a snippet, but there was a bigger backdrop of whatever was going on in the country at the time. So the Just Say No campaign, this is like Urban Outfitters for you guys, but this was like a real thing when I was a kid. And Just Say No was Nancy Reagan's thing. So she went around the country telling people, your kids, just say no to drugs. So, and then there was this is your brain on drugs, all that ad campaign. At the same time, Congress looked at crack as being this horrible, horrible thing that was permeating the country, and that we needed, by God, to do something about it. And so they implemented legislation that made offenses for crack users much more stringent than for powder coke. This was, by all accounts, a racist piece of legislation because blacks were using more crack than whites were. And it wound up putting a lot of black men in jail for long, long periods of time. Recently, this legislation has been reversed so that the sentencing guidelines for crack and powder cocaine have been brought closer in line to each other. But there was this morality war going on that, you shouldn't be doing these things because it's not right and because we say so. What these efforts successfully did was very little. What they really did accomplish were three things. One was that it drove drugs underground, so that people who were using were less accessible to society, and that was okay because you were sort of sweeping them under the rug. It also changed a bit the kinds of drugs that were being used and the kinds of drugs that were available. So people, if they couldn't get access to stuff, they would start making their own. So methamphetamine became a burgeoning business, starting in California and then moving its way east. And then in addition to that, it marginalized users so that people who needed treatment couldn't get it because they were not welcome. The third thing was that it made research dollars very, very difficult to come by. So research on how to treat drug users, how to prevent things that were related to drug use that impacted HIV and other disease states, that was very difficult funding to get a hold of because Congress had made appropriations to the NIH. NIH doled out that money, and periodically somebody from NIH would get pulled before Congress and shown the titles to grants and say, how do you justify to my constituents that you're funding this work on, gay people and drug users? What am I supposed to tell my constituents that their tax dollars are going for this kind of thing? So a lot of really bad and unsavory things were going on at this point in time. The effect, paradoxically, with all this was that it made people less educated about drugs because it was just sort of just say no. It was don't talk about it. Just don't talk. Don't look at it. Just say no. So safe stuff in schools, so drug education and safe sex education started to get chipped away to the point where it is now, which is actually quite low overall. And that impacted people's ability to decide to use in an informed way, and if they were going to use, on how to use safely. So if you don't know about these drugs and you've never heard anything about them, or if you're going to use them, how to protect yourself, and you go out there and you want to experiment and you meet somebody and they want to, for instance, with cocaine, they say, well, you should shoot this because it's a hardcore user. You might want to start with snorting first, but they say you should shoot up first. If you knew a little bit about how cocaine was done, you might think, well, this seems a little extreme. Maybe I'll try snorting first. So this is one phase that then moved into the 1990s, which really wasn't all that much different, unfortunately. The types of drugs that were being used changed a bit. Crack was still king in the South. But other drugs like methamphetamine and ecstasy, MDMA, began to take root. The rave scene became popular and infamous for having easy access to any kind of drug that you could want, basically in a party setting. And then circuit parties began to spring up, and circuit parties are these kind of weekend-long dance parties that ironically started off as AIDS fundraisers, and they're gay men and attend these weekend-long parties and dance and do a whole lot of drugs and have a whole lot of sex. So this culture kind of matured in the 90s, and not a lot was being done. The DEA and other agencies picked specific drugs to go after. With you can decide whether or not that's been a successful effort or not. But I think that what we moved from the 1980s into the 1990s, not a whole lot changed in terms of the culture of drug use in this country. This is the problem. So people do crazy shit. So if you're drunk or you're high, you don't know what you're doing. So you may feel hypersexual. You may, beer goggles. You may think you're God's gift to women or men. You may think that sex is way more awesome than it actually is. You may be more impulsive, that you're more willing to react to cues that other people are giving you, or that you think that other people are giving you. You may feel really, really hot. And then your ability to make decisions is obviously impaired because you're drunk or you're high. There's also a phenomenon called instant bottoms. So instant bottoming is kind of unique to methamphetamine, and it's a physiologic issue because meth users sometimes have difficulty maintaining an erection. So if you're a gay man and you get on meth and you really, really, really have to have sex right now and you can't get it up, then you're going to bottom. You're going to be the receptive partner. And if that's not a role that you're used to and you don't know how to do it, that dramatically increases your risk of bad things happening. Okay? Not the least of which also in here is if you try to put on a condom when you're drunk we have laws against drunk driving, but it's probably equally difficult to try to put on a condom if you're drunk. or high. So there's a lot of different issues that are related to just the effects on your cognition and your sensorium being on drugs. This is one of the major reasons that drugs play a critical role in HIV, is because it's an STD. These same lists could apply to any STD, really. So this is not necessarily unique to HIV, but it clearly impacts the HIV transmission. Okay, so where are we now with HIV and with drug use? So I know that you've seen charts like this from different people, but this was data from 2008, looking at 1977 through 2006. This top curve is men who have sex with men, so gay men. So the peak happened in the mid-'80s. Much of this drop-off is related to community prevention efforts that got going in the gay community, and also a whole lot of people dying. So the pool of people that could transmit to others was rapidly diminishing, because treatment first became available in 1987, after the peak. Then there was this gradual creep up in the last part of 2000s, and a lot of people try to put this around the same time that the cocktail became available, that HAART became available in 1995 to 1996. That data, to me, is a little wishy-washy, but a lot of people believe that because the cocktail came on the scene, that people thought, well, I can just go back to doing whatever I was doing, because there are treatments that can save my life. Injection drug use, you can see, also had a peak that kind of was maximized in the late 1980s, around 1990, and then came down dramatically through a variety of different efforts, a lot of which centered on drug interdiction. And so the contribution from injection drug use is relatively low today. And then the heterosexual epidemic began slow and has taken off. But again, point out that MSM represent a very substantial proportion. This is new data that came out last summer from CDC, updating that chart. And what it showed was that there's a lot of things that are maybe perhaps predictable about the way that the epidemic is behaving. But among men, black men are overwhelmingly impacted. They represent the fastest growing group of new infections, followed by Latinos and whites. And the same general trend is true for women, but overwhelmingly black men are being impacted. Men who have sex with men in 2009 represented 61%. This is actually an increase from the prior period. Injection drug use, about 9% by itself, and if you fold in men who have sex with men who also shoot drugs, about 12%. And then heterosexuals about a quarter, 27%. And this is the real tragedy, in my opinion, and this is what I see clinically in my patients. I take care of mostly HIV-infected patients, and mostly guys who have brand new HIV infection, so acute HIV. They're still symptomatic with new infection by the time that I see them. And these numbers are, to me, it's tragic. So this is MSM aged 13 to 29. This is 2006, 7, 8, and 9. So this youngest age group among men of color is the only group in the epidemic that's expanding, statistically significantly expanding. The total number of new cases is static, but the proportions of each risk group are shifting. And this is the group that's expanding the most. It increased 48% over this time period. That's a lot. So that's the HIV epidemic right now. Now the drugs. So when I first saw these data, so the UN publishes this very interesting report called the World Drug Report that's very informative. So if you really want to know what the price of heroin is in Bangkok, you can find that out. If you want to know how it made it there from wherever it was grown, it has a map that shows you. Very cool report, actually. I was shocked because as a kid, cocaine was king. So coke, I was always told that, coke will kill you. It's the worst thing ever. And it is bad. I'm not trying to minimize cocaine. But in terms of the overall amount of stuff that's being used globally, it's at the bottom of the heap. So cannabis, marijuana is king. So between 120 and 190 million users globally, with 66,000 metric tons produced. That's a lot of weed. amphetamine-type stimulants, which include both methamphetamine and amphetamine, and ecstasy. So ecstasy is a derivative of amphetamine. That is next. So up to 53 million users globally. And then opiates, with heroin being the one that we associate most with addiction, and then cocaine. So lots of different things, and this is clearly not a problem unique to the United States or the developed world. This is a map from that same report. This is the 2011 update of that report that shows where the drugs are and where they're being used. And I think that a couple things I wanted to point out is that just like with real estate, everything is location, location, location. So if you're in Africa and you don't have any place that's growing opium poppy anywhere nearby, but you do have a lot of marijuana, you're going to be using marijuana. If you're in Russia and Afghanistan and Myanmar and Laos are within traveling distance of you, and they're the places where opium poppy is being grown and heroin is being produced, then you're going to be using heroin. In the United States, we're lucky because we're the melting pot for everything. We have a little bit of everything because we're imported from everywhere else. So we have cocaine from South America, we have amphetamine-type stimulants from Southeast Asia and from Mexico that are being produced in Mexico, mass manufactured methamphetamine, opiates that are being imported from Southeast Asia and from Europe. So we're lucky, I guess, in terms of demand, supply and demand. But the point is that there are clearly regional things that influence drug use, and this parlays into regional things that happen with HIV transmission. So in the former Soviet bloc right now, it's a massive injection drug use epidemic that's going on, and tons of people that are being infected with HIV as a direct function of the Russian government not doing anything for needle exchange programs, safe injection, anything of that nature. So, okay, drugs. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on marijuana or alcohol. These are clearly the most commonly used drugs when you talk about the drugs that are implicated with HIV in the United States. Marijuana and alcohol pop up all the time, in addition to poppers. Most of this has to do with the fact that you're not quite yourself when you're using one or the other. I think there are a lot of difficulties with both of these drugs in the United States. So I'm not going to dwell too terribly much on them. Cocaine is produced from coca leaves. So coca is a plant that's grown in South America. The leaves are mashed into a paste. The paste is dried. That's pure, almost pure cocaine, so 90% pure. Then it gets cut with various other things. So the stuff that you buy on the street is never as pure as what's made in South America. Crack has very varying purity. So some of it's very good and some of it's very bad, depending on who your dealer is. Opium poppy is grown in the current manufacturing, of course, of Afghanistan is the major producer in the world. When we invaded, ironically, poppy became a crop again. So before the U.S. invasion, the Taliban had banned the growing of poppy. And then we came in and everything got set back to normal. And so poppy became the number one crop again in Afghanistan. What you do is you score the outside of the poppy, and it winds up kind of making this gum, latex gum. That gum has morphine in it. And then that is then processed to become powder heroin, and then various different forms of heroin can be produced, black tar being the one I think is most infamous, but also the least pure. Club drugs is kind of this junk term that incorporates stimulants and depressants, relaxants. MDMA, which is ecstasy, is probably the most important one globally, but gamma hydroxybutyrate, so roofies, and various other things. I would point out that in this picture, these two things, anybody know what those are? It's Viagra. So Viagra has found a place as a club drug because a lot of these club drugs wind up with erectile dysfunction as one of their side effects. So especially in circuit parties, gay clubs, Viagra is part of the mix. And then finally methamphetamine, which started off in the 60s as with biker gangs in California making methamphetamine. Crank, the name crank came from storing it in crank cases of their motorcycles to smuggle it from place to place. That drug really has exploded. So efforts to suppress manufacture in the United States have been overwhelmingly successful. So DEA targeted this drug for eradication in the United States because people were making it in kind of backwoods meth labs. With the renewal of the Patriot Act, there was a stipulation that put Sudafed, the real deal Sudafed, behind the counter. So when you're feeling horrible and you have a cold and you have to talk to somebody at the pharmacy counter to get your real stuff that works. But that's the basis for making methamphetamine in your own lab. By putting it behind the counter, it made it harder to get. And so if you look at figures from the DEA, the number of clandestine lab busts has dramatically fallen since the renewal of the Patriot Act. The problem is that the street purity of methamphetamine prior to Patriot Act was much less than what it is now. Because if your dim-witted relatives in the backwoods are not cooking it themselves, they're importing it from Mexico. And the stuff that's being made in Mexico is being made by professionals who can get the stuff to almost 100% purity. So it's a trade-off. We're not having any homegrown, but we're getting better stuff from overseas now. Okay, so why do people get addicted in the first place? And this is the answer, appropriately for Valentine's Day. Dopamine. Dopamine is the answer. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter like serotonin. So dopamine is the neurotransmitter of reward. So if you do something good, you want to do it again. If it feels good, there's a reason for it, and that's dopamine. So you get a little squirt of dopamine in your brain, and that reinforces you to do whatever it is that you just did, to do it again. It's a very, very powerful reinforcement. So this is what drives addiction of all sorts. If it's exercise or eating or crack cocaine, it's all dopamine. So these graphs that I want to show you show proportion of baseline dopamine levels that you get from stimuli, from specific stimuli. So food, you get a little bump because you want to eat. It's part of staying alive. Sex gives you about twice that amount. So the originator of these graphs said that good sex is like 2 cheeseburgers. I don't know if that's true or not. But it gives you a more of an increase than food does. Alcohol is about comparable to sex, but a little bit longer lasting in terms of dopamine, not the sex. Nicotine is is most comparable to alcohol of all these. Morphine gives you less substantial rise, but a longer run. So you get a greater length of activity with morphine and morphine derivatives. And there's cocaine. So cocaine, when I was a kid, cocaine was the bad thing, right? So you get quite a lot of dopamine released with coke. This has been clearly implicated in why coke, those stories that people tell of, I used it only one time and I got hooked, that's a truism. The problem is that methamphetamine came along. So this is meth. This is regardless of purity. Meth is a much, much, much more potent stimulator of dopamine than cocaine is. And so what people wind up with chronic methamphetamine use is that they burn out the ability of their brain to even make dopamine. And that winds up with a variety of different neurologic problems. So there's lots of issues with methamphetamine users. And fortunately, the Appalachians have sort of, for whatever reason, have protected the Southeast from methamphetamine, which sort of stopped at Tennessee. So California through Missouri and then Tennessee and into the Northeast a bit. There's some very interesting research that's looked at cultural reasons. So crack in the Southeast is normative. People know it. And so there's a lot of fear among potential users of methamphetamine about, well, I know crack and I know if I use this amount of stuff that I'm going to get this high for this long. I don't know anything about this other stuff. And so it's in a way that crack has been perversely kind of protective against methamphetamine in the Southeast. We have very little meth in North Carolina, at least that I've run into clinically. with my patients or with other patients that we take care of at UNC. I do have one patient, however, who gets his shipped to him from Portland, from Portland, Oregon. So, go UPS. What can Brown do for you? These are, not only the drug impacts the addiction potential, but also that slope of that curve, how quickly the dopamine gets released is very intimately tied to how fast it gets in your system. So these are various routes of doing, this is specific to methamphetamine, but the general things apply here. So smoking has a relatively small time to effect because it's going right to your nose, which is right access to your brain. Hot railing is a form of using where you take a glass tube, you heat one end red hot, and you put the other end in your nose, and the red hot end in the meth. The methamphetamine or whatever drug that you're trying to hot rail sublimates. It goes directly from solid to gas and you snort it. So it's a combination of smoking and snorting that's quite effective. Slamming is injection drug use. Snorting is snorting, and booty bump is my personal favorite, which is the intrarectal installation of a drug. We'll get to that in a second. Okay. Smoking and pipes, it's not rocket science that people smoke with pipes, right? You can use anything that you want. So some people use tin foil. This is a regular old crack pipe, with the incandescent bulb going the way of the dodo. Who knows what people are going to be using these days? Hopefully something better than this. But people improvise. So crack and other drugs can be smoked. Methamphetamine can be smoked. Meth pipes typically are structured a bit differently. This bottom series of pictures shows that process of cooking. People usually use a kind of butane lighter, so it gets really, really hot, really, really fast, so that you wind up with comparatively little remaining stuff in the bottom. And this was not a particularly good batch of meth, so there's some residue left in the bottom. And then there's shooting up. So when I trained in Rhode Island in residency, one of the first patients I took care of was somebody who had overdosed in prison. And I, being the naive person that I was, said, well, how could this have happened? How could they have overdosed when they were in prison? And I had people look at me like, come on, really, kid? Seriously. You could get anything you want in prison, including syringes, and including heroin, which was a big problem in the Northeast, and particularly in Rhode Island. So to inject, you wind up dissolving whatever it is that you want to shoot in a spoon. So a little bit of liquid. It helps to acidify it a bit. So some users will use lemon juice. A couple of drops of lemon juice in there make it dissolve a bit better. And then you load whatever it is into your syringe. And then if you're shooting, you shoot by yourself. If you're cooking and you're sharing with other people, sharing what you cook, you can transfer whatever you've just dissolved a couple of different ways. So one way is called backloading. Backloading is that your friend takes the plunger out of his syringe and you squirt from your syringe into the back of their syringe. Front loading is your friend puts the needle on his syringe, puts it into the front of your syringe and draws out. Both of those have implications for transmission of HIV, pretty significant implications. And so both backloading and front loading can transfer HIV, as well as hepatitis C and hepatitis B, if there's blood that's been in contact with whatever's dissolved or that's remaining on the inside of the syringe after a prior use. So there very definitely are risks that are related to not only the injection part, but the sharing of needles among users and how a cook cooks and how a cook shares whatever is being prepared. There are myriad health issues with injecting, and so some of these, not to kind of creep you out, but I'll go through some of the more common things that we run into. This little white line is a needle, a tip of a needle that's been broken off into somebody's vein. This bump is an abscess. This is a bacterial infection that's situated around that needle because the needle's not supposed to be in your vein for that long. And this is what it would look like from the outside, kind of a red, raised, very angry, very painful lesion on the skin. track marks from people routinely using the same vein and then winding up blowing that vein. If you don't clean off your skin before you inject, then whatever's living on your skin can be injected with whatever you're injecting. And we have bacteria that normally live on our skin, Staphylococcus aureus, among a lot of different other ones. Staph is perhaps the most important for this, which is infective endocarditis. This is infection inside the heart. So you inject through contaminated skin, essentially, and you've inoculated your bloodstream with bacteria. You can imagine that's not a normal thing to have happen. And if you have anything that's abnormal about your heart valves, then staph and other bacteria can latch on and start growing. The material itself is kind of the consistency of chicken fat. It's very loose, friable material, but it's very adherent to the valve. So your valves are doing what they're normally doing throughout your day, but they've got this kind of gunk that's attached to the leaflets. Sometimes that gunk gets flicked off. And so that flicked off stuff can wind up in your lungs, it can wind up in your brain causing an abscess or stroke. It can wind up in your fingertips and your toes. So we can see these little spots that have characteristic names and appearance that if we have somebody who has the right picture, we can kind of just look at them from the outside and know what's going on inside without doing cultures to see if there really are bacteria there. And then this is a picture of the back of your eye. So the optic nerve is this yellow thing. These are just vessels that are coming out. It's kind of creepy when you look in the back of the eye because the blood vessels come right out of the middle of the nerve and they spread out in the back of your eye. So all this light orange is the retina. And this is healthy, this is not healthy. What can happen is that either with a bacterial infection in the blood or if people use citrus to help dissolve whatever they're cooking, fungus, a particular fungus called Candida, it's a yeast, likes to live on citrus. And if it gets into that fluid, you're injecting fungus into your bloodstream. That's also not very good, and in some ways is arguably worse than bacteria. And it can wind up in the back of your eye. So this is another thing that we look at with injection drug users, is a very careful examination of the back of the eye to see if there are areas where a little plug of whatever it is has jammed up a blood vessel and caused the retina beyond it to die. So these white patches are dead retina that's not coming back. And then kind of the queen mama of issues, I think, is hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is another bloodborne virus transmitted the same way as HIV and hepatitis B. About 85% of people, unlike hepatitis B, where most people clear the infection on their own, most people who are exposed to hepatitis C get it for good. So about 85% of people. And of that group, over half progress to cirrhosis. Cirrhosis is scarring on the inside of your liver that winds up causing the normal blood flow that comes from your intestines that through the course of the day always passes through your liver first. It can't go through your liver because it's blocked by scar tissue. That fluid then builds up and you wind up with a whole bunch of different kinds of complications from that. And then eventually liver failure. Treatment is possible, and there are new treatments that we're seeing right now that treatment for hepatitis C is becoming revolutionized in the same way that HIV treatment was in the late 1990s. Hepatitis C is really on the verge right now of a new shift where the treatment is going to be much, much more efficacious and easier on people to do. The hitch is that there's no protection against reinfection. So hepatitis C, you don't get antibodies that neutralize it. So there are very definitely cases of people who've been infected, been cured by conventional treatments now, who inject again and get reinfected again. So, and this is what a lot of people are worried about with HIV. If we do get to a point where we can cure it, that there may be no protection against reinfection. So hepatitis C is not a very pleasant disease. I take care of some people with, and I just had one person die about 6 months ago from hepatitis C, very suddenly actually. And then snorting is snorting. So snorting, the main risk with snorting is that if you share your straw, whatever you're sticking up your nose, with somebody else, that anybody who's had a nosebleed, your nose is a bloody place. It's very well vascularized. So any damage to the lining of your nose, you get a little bit of blood. That little bit of blood on the outside of a straw in this nostril and down to your friends can transmit. So HIV, Hep C, Hep B, very definitely transmit. Okay, and then booty bumping. So booty bumping, I'll take a drink before I talk about booty bumping. Booty bumping is pretty unique to methamphetamine and cocaine. So you dissolve it, and then you take a syringe without the needle, and you put it in your butt, and you squirt whatever it is in your syringe into your butt. The advantage is that you get a relatively slow uptake. This is akin to putting an aspirin under your tongue, or something that's going to dissolve on your tongue. So you get a relatively rapid but a nice even dissolution into your bloodstream, because the inside of the rectum is very well vascularized. This is part of why HIV risk is as great as it is for unprotected anal sex. The problem is that if you imagine that if you're not very good at dissolving this stuff, you're essentially putting kind of granulated stuff in your butt. And if you then have sex, it's not a good combination for HIV transmission, because the lining is irritated. And clearly very tiny breaks or damage to the lining of the rectum is the risk factor, a risk factor for transmission of HIV. Okay, last little chunk of stuff here. So recent developments. 2009, everything changed in this country for a lot of reasons. And one of them was that Congress lifted the federal ban on needle exchange. This was a momentous thing. Because this has been a really, really long time coming. And a lot of people, New York Times included, said this is great. We're finally catching up to the rest of the world. Let's go forward. The problem was that money was very slow to leave Washington. So slow, in fact, that it gave time for this to happen, which was at the very start of this year, the ban was reinstated. So we had it and now we don't. So we're back very much to where we were before 2009. The only good thing that happened around the same time was that there had been a ban on immigration to this country if you're HIV infected. So you could not, if you had HIV and you knew it, you could not visit the United States. You were barred from entering the country. For purposes of scientific meetings, this was a big deal, because there are a lot of people who are doing HIV research that have HIV themselves, and a lot of activists who go to those meetings that have HIV. That ban got lifted at the same time that the needle exchange ban got lifted. And as a result, the first time in 20 some odd years that the International AIDS Conference has been held in the United States, continuing this summer in Washington, D.C., which is a great thing. But the winds of change are blowing. One other thing that happened in 2009 was this. So this was very much kind of harkening back to Bleach Man. This was put out by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And what it looked, it was a simple thing that was, this is how you shoot. If you're going to shoot, this is how you clean your needles. If you encouraging you don't share your needles, take care of your veins, take care of yourself, sterilize your skin before you shoot. And everybody, the shit hit the fan with this thing. Public health agencies all across the country said this was great, and then a lot of political groups said this is a really, really bad idea. And the same kinds of arguments, it was history repeating itself, same kinds of things. Well, if you give people this pamphlet, they're going to know how to shoot, and they're going to start shooting up. And it's going to make it easier for them to start using if they hadn't been using before, which is kind of crazy, in my opinion. Okay. So some more information for people that are interested in this material a bit more. I would highly encourage any of you to look at this website, which for reasons that are unclear to me is blocked in the hospital. But in my office building it's not, but in the hospital it is. This is called Talk to Frank. Don't put in .org, it's .com, so talktofrank.com. This website is British. So there are a lot of extra U's and vowels that we don't need. This website is really fantastic because it gives very plain, understandable language about what the drugs are, if you're going to use, how do you use them, what are appropriate weights and measures so that you don't overdose the first time you use. It's plain talk about what the drugs are and if you're going to use to help you use safely. It's a fantastically informative website. North Carolina has the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition. This group is statewide, and their purpose is to promote programs in conjunction with law enforcement that promote needle exchange and other harm reduction efforts in the state. Currently, there's only one county, which is Buncombe County, Asheville, that allows needle exchange. And it's still technically banned by the state, but the sheriff in Buncombe County and in the city of Asheville have turned a blind eye for many years to the fact that this exists. It's been a very successful program and has helped a lot, but it's the only one of its kind in the state. Exchange Supplies is a company that provides low-cost solutions to help people inject safely and other harm reduction stuff for drug users. It's simple stuff like color-coded syringes, which is kind of a brilliant idea, really. So that if you've got a whole box of stuff and they all look the same, that you may not know that you're about to share with somebody else. But if John has the blue one and Mary has the orange one, if you're not colorblind, then you're all set. It also has little packets of citric acid. Instead of squeezing your lemon onto your heroin, it's sterile citric acid, sterile saline to dissolve your stuff in. It's common sense stuff provided for agencies and for individuals. And then finally, Tweaker. Tweaker is a website that's devoted exclusively to methamphetamine. So it's perhaps less of an issue here, but it's very much like Talk to Frank in that it gives very clear and easy to understand information about meth, how you use it, what it does to you, what the addiction potential is, how to use it safely if you decide to use. And I think that's it. So I'm happy to take questions from people.